This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one country, or one protest, or one decision made in a single room. This is about something quieter, something that was built slowly, deliberately, and almost invisibly, and something that is now failing all at once. For years, a system promised safety by avoiding confrontation. It promised stability by choosing the cheapest path. It promised control by believing chaos could be outsourced. That promise is breaking. Not because of a single shock, but because the system was designed to depend on instability and call it strategy. What looks like disorder on the surface is actually pressure revealing a fault line. And once that line appears, it does not heal. It widens. If you stay with me, you'll see why this moment matters far beyond what's on the screen right now. Because the danger isn't the unrest. It's what was quietly built on top of it. And once you see it, you can't unsee what comes next. What actually runs this system now is not ideology, not alliances, not even power in the traditional sense. It's dependency. A dependency so deep it stopped being debated, so normalized it stopped being named. For years, control shifted quietly away from governments and toward flows, energy flows, shipping routes, insurance approvals, payment channels that don't show up on a ballot but decide outcomes anyway. Once a system depends on uninterrupted flow, it becomes fragile by design, because anyone who can slow that flow, even briefly, can apply pressure without firing a shot. That's the shift most people missed. The center of gravity moved from who governs to who can interrupt. And when stability depends on places that are structurally unstable, risk stops being external. It moves inside the system. That's when resilience turns into exposure, and strategy quietly becomes a liability. Because the system doesn't break where you're watching. It breaks where you assumed it was safe. And that assumption is about to be tested. There was a time when this system worked differently, not because the world was calmer, but because risk was spread. Supply came from many directions. Contracts were boring. Reliability mattered more than price. Then something changed, slowly. Cheap became strategic. Exceptions became policy. Temporary workarounds became permanent architecture. What once required emergency planning became routine. Oil didn't just arrive, it arrived discounted. Quietly, repeatedly, predictably, until it wasn't. The most dangerous part wasn't the shift itself. It was how normal it felt. No alarms, no speeches, just balance sheets improving quarter after quarter. But slow change rewires expectations. And once a system adapts to fragility, it starts mistaking it for strength. Dependence didn't look like dependence. It looked like efficiency. And that illusion held right up until the moment pressure arrived from multiple directions at once. Because systems don't fail when one thing goes wrong. They fail when everything they normalized goes wrong together. And that moment is no longer theoretical. Then the first shock arrived. Not as a headline, as a disruption. Shipments hesitated, ports slowed, schedules stopped lining up the way they always had. What looked like noise was actually a signal, because nothing in this system is supposed to hesitate. It's designed for constant motion. When unrest spreads, oil doesn't just keep flowing out of habit. Workers hesitate, insurers recalculate, middlemen pause, and the pause is the story. This wasn't a collapse, it was worse. It was uncertainty, because markets can price loss. They cannot price doubt. Each delayed shipment forced substitutions. Each substitution raised costs. Each cost increase was absorbed quietly at first. If you're still watching, this is the point where the system stops being abstract, because what followed next wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because once procedures start failing, the system doesn't snap. It unravels, and it never unravels all at once. Here's how the system actually works, not in theory, in practice. Cheap supply doesn't just lower costs, it reshapes infrastructure. Refineries are modified, logistics are optimized, contracts are written to assume a specific kind of crude arrives on a specific schedule from a specific place. That's the lock-in. Once built, the system cannot pivot quickly. Not without losses, not without delays, not without someone absorbing the damage. And that damage never lands where the deal was signed. It lands downstream, on smaller operators first, on thin margins. On facilities designed to survive only if everything arrives on time and exactly as expected. The benefit stays concentrated, the risk gets distributed. So when supply wobbles, the system doesn't ask who caused it, it asks who can endure it. And the answer is never the same group that saved money when things were calm. That's the mechanism. It rewards stability taking and punishes adaptability, which works right up until instability becomes the rule instead of the exception. Then the second shock hit. Faster, closer, less forgiving. Shipments stopped arriving on schedule. Some arrived altered. Some didn't arrive at all. Refineries slowed, then adjusted, then slowed again. Every workaround cost more. Every delay rippled outward. Inventories were tapped, reserves released, schedules rewritten daily. None of that fixes the problem. It only buys time. And time, in this system, is expensive. Because each fix assumes the next shipment will arrive. And when that assumption fails, the margin disappears. What once felt manageable now feels fragile. Not collapsing, just unstable. And instability changes behavior. Hesitation spreads, orders shrink, risk premiums rise. This is how systems accelerate toward failure, not with a crash, with a series of rational decisions that all make sense in isolation, until suddenly they don't. And by then, the system is already moving faster than anyone can slow it down. This is where it reaches you, not as a theory, not as geopolitics, as cost, as delay, as pressure that shows up without explanation. You don't see the tanker that didn't arrive. You feel the price that quietly adjusted, the shipment that took longer, the margin that disappeared. When energy tightens, everything downstream stiffens. Transport, manufacturing, jobs that suddenly feel less secure without anyone saying why. And the most unsettling part is how subtle it is. No announcement, no emergency broadcast, just small changes that stack. If you're still watching, this matters, because this system was designed to pass risk outward, away from decision makers, toward people who don't get a vote on strategy. And once that transfer begins, it doesn't reverse easily, because the system doesn't ask whether the pressure is fair, only whether it can continue. And for now, it can, which is exactly why the next phase is more dangerous than the last. This is no longer contained. What began as localized instability doesn't stay local in a system built on flow. It propagates. Shipping routes reroute. Insurance rules tighten. Ports thousands of miles away start recalculating risk they didn't create. When one supply line becomes unreliable, pressure doesn't vanish. It relocates. Other producers gain leverage. Other buyers pay more. Every substitution creates a new imbalance somewhere else. That's how a regional disruption becomes systemic. Markets don't ask where the problem started. They respond to where friction appears. And now friction is appearing everywhere at once. Energy markets tighten. Freight costs rise. Governments quietly adjust assumptions they can't publicly revise yet. What was once treated as a bilateral issue is now embedded in global pricing, in planning models, in expectations. And when expectations shift, behavior follows. The system hasn't broken, but it has changed. And once global systems change direction, they rarely return to the path they were on, which brings us to what happens next. From here, the system moves along three possible paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment. Costs rise, supplies diversify. Efficiency is sacrificed for resilience. Growth slows, but control is partially restored. This path looks responsible. It is also expensive and politically difficult to sustain. The second path is erosion. Temporary fixes become permanent again. Reserves are used to mask deeper strain. Risk is normalized. Nothing collapses, but everything works a little worse each year. This path feels stable, until it suddenly isn't. The third path is rupture. A disruption hits faster than substitutions can compensate. Confidence breaks before supply does. Markets overreact. Decisions are made under pressure instead of planning. None of these paths are chosen deliberately. They emerge from behavior, from what gets delayed, from what gets denied, from what leaders assume will hold just a little longer. And right now, the system is drifting, not correcting, not confronting. Drifting is not neutral. It's momentum without control, and momentum always carries you somewhere. There's a temptation at moments like this to look for reassurance, for a stabilizing force, for someone, somewhere who has this under control. But systems like this don't fail loudly. They fail quietly, then suddenly. What you're watching isn't a crisis. It's a reveal of what happens when efficiency replaces resilience, when dependence is mistaken for strategy, when short-term advantage hardens into long-term exposure. Nothing here requires panic, but it does require attention, because once a system teaches itself to survive instability, it stops recognizing danger, until danger becomes unavoidable. This story doesn't end tonight. It doesn't end with a policy announcement or a market correction. It continues in decisions made off-camera, in assumptions left unchallenged. In flows we notice only when they stop. If you want to understand what comes next, not the headlines, but the pressure underneath them, this is where you keep watching. Because the most important part of this story hasn't happened yet. And when it does, it won't ask whether you were ready.